Brian Entin says, "There was someone Annie Guthrie couldn't stop watching. Not out of curiosity, not out of the ordinary attention a person pays to a neighbor or a passing car." Sources close to the case describe something more deliberate, a pattern of attention that repeated itself enough times that people around her started to notice it, and started to wonder what she was actually looking for. This is a claim, not a finding. It hasn't been confirmed in a courtroom, and it may never be. But the sourcing behind it is specific enough and consistent enough across the people who reportedly witnessed it that Entin's reporting treats it as one of the more significant behavioral details to emerge from the weeks before Nancy disappeared. Who Annie was watching, and why, is the story tonight. Everything you're about to hear comes from reported claims, unconfirmed source accounts, and allegations that have not been proven in any legal proceeding. Nothing here should be treated as established fact. This is an examination of what has been reported, placed in context, with every uncertainty stated plainly as we go. By the time this video ends, you'll understand why one small, quiet habit, a woman standing at a window, watching a driveway, watching a car, watching a person come and go, became one of the more unsettling details investigators reportedly had to account for. And you'll understand why the person she was watching may not have been who anyone expected. Before we get into who she was watching, it's worth understanding what kind of person Annie Guthrie reportedly was in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. Because watching someone isn't neutral behavior. It's not something a person does without reason, and in Annie's case, according to multiple accounts, it wasn't something she did casually either. The picture that's emerged through reporting describes someone who paid close attention to her surroundings, someone who noticed cars that didn't belong on the street, someone who tracked who came and left a property, and when. This wasn't described as paranoia by the people who observed it, at least not initially. It was described as vigilance, the kind of behavior that, on its own, could belong to a woman being careful. Or it could belong to a woman being careful for a very specific reason. That distinction matters, and it's one the investigation reportedly hasn't resolved. Was Annie watching because she suspected something was wrong and wanted to protect someone she loved? Or was she watching because she had reason to track a person whose movements mattered to something else entirely, something she may have been managing rather than reacting to? Both versions are apparently still on the table, and both versions are why this detail, small as it sounds, carries the weight it does. According to the accounts that have circulated, this wasn't a single instance of watching someone. It was a pattern, repeated enough times, and consistent enough in its timing, that at least one person close to the situation described it as deliberate rather than incidental. The reports suggest Annie would position herself where she had a clear line of sight to a specific point, sometimes a driveway, sometimes a stretch of road, sometimes a spot near the edge of the property. She would remain there for extended periods. Not glancing, watching, the kind of stillness that suggests someone waiting for a specific outcome rather than someone passing time. One source, according to Entin's reporting, described it plainly. She wasn't just looking outside, she was tracking something. That word, tracking, is doing a lot of work in this story, and it's worth sitting with. Tracking implies intention. It implies that whatever Annie was watching for had a rhythm she was trying to learn, a pattern she was trying to confirm. People don't track things they're indifferent to. They track things they believe matter. And once that behavior was placed into the timeline, the investigation had already built. Once investigators reportedly understood when this watching started and how it lined up against everything else Annie had been doing in the weeks before Nancy vanished, the whole situation started to look a lot more serious than a woman being careful about her surroundings. So who was she watching? The reporting on this point has been careful, and for good reason. The person Annie was reportedly focused on has not been named publicly in a way that's been independently confirmed, and speculating recklessly here would be irresponsible. What can be said, based on the accounts that have surfaced, is that it was not a stranger in any conventional sense. It was someone with an existing connection to the property, to the family, or to the surrounding circumstances of the case. Someone whose presence would not have seemed unusual to a casual observer, but whose specific movements apparently mattered enough to Annie that she felt compelled to track them. That detail changes the shape of the story considerably. If Annie had been watching a total stranger, someone unconnected, someone whose presence was genuinely anomalous, the interpretation would be simple: alarm, suspicion of an outsider, the natural instinct of someone protecting a home from an unknown threat. But watching someone who already belonged in the picture, someone whose presence wouldn't have raised eyebrows in anyone else, requires a different kind of attention, It requires already knowing enough about that person to believe their ordinary movements meant something extraordinary. It requires, in other words, existing suspicion, not the kind that develops from noticing something wrong for the first time, but the kind that develops from confirming something a person already believed. That's the version of Annie Guthrie this detail points toward, not someone startled into vigilance by a stranger's presence. Someone already primed to look for confirmation of something she suspected, and finding, in this person's comings and goings, exactly the kind of pattern she seemed to be looking for. How this detail reportedly came to light matters almost as much as the detail itself, because it shapes how much weight the claim can carry. According to the reporting, it didn't come from Annie. It didn't come from an official statement or a piece of physical evidence recovered from the property. It came from people around her, a neighbor, according to one account, who noticed Annie standing at the same window on more than one occasion, at times that lined up with a specific vehicle's arrival. A separate account, reportedly gathered during witness interviews, described Annie asking pointed questions about someone's schedule, when they usually arrived, when they usually left, questions that, on their own, might seem like idle curiosity, but that read differently once placed next to the window-watching behavior other people had independently described. It's the independence of these accounts that gives the detail its investigative weight. When one person describes a behavior, it's an observation. When multiple people, without apparent coordination, describe the same behavior from different angles, the watching, the questions about timing, the noticeable focus on one person's movements, it starts to look less like a single anecdote and more like a documented pattern. That doesn't make it proven. Witness accounts can be mistaken, can be shaped by hindsight, can be influenced by everything that happened afterward. A neighbor who later learns about a disappearance may reinterpret an innocent detail through a darker lens without meaning to. That possibility has to stay on the table. But the reported consistency across separate sources is exactly the kind of detail that turns a passing rumor into something an investigation takes seriously enough to chase down. And once investigators reportedly started chasing it down, the next question became unavoidable, not just what Annie was watching, but what she thought she was seeing. If Annie really was tracking this person's movements with the kind of deliberate attention multiple sources describe, then the obvious question is what she believed those movements meant. What was she looking for? What would have counted, in her mind, as confirmation? The reporting suggests a few possibilities, none of them confirmed, all of them consistent with a woman who believed something about this person's presence didn't add up. She may have been watching for a pattern of visits that occurred at unusual hours, arrivals late at night, departures early in the morning, timing that didn't match any explanation that had been offered to her. She may have been watching for a vehicle that didn't belong to the person it was supposedly associated with, or a vehicle that changed, swapped, or appeared different from one visit to the next, in a way that suggested something being concealed. She may have simply been watching to see whether this person's account of where they'd been, and when, lined up with what she could observe with her own eyes. Each of these is plausible. None of them is confirmed. But together, they paint a picture of someone conducting her own quiet verification process, testing a suspicion against reality, one observation at a time, rather than confronting it directly. That's a specific kind of behavior, and it says something about the person doing it. Someone who suspects something and confronts it head-on is behaving one way. Someone who suspects something and instead builds a private record of evidence, watching, timing, noting, without saying a word to the person they're watching, is behaving in a very different way. It suggests someone who didn't yet trust her suspicion enough to act on it, or someone who understood that acting on it too soon might cost her the very confirmation she needed. Either way, the audience should walk away from this section understanding one thing clearly. By every account that's surfaced, Annie's watching was not accidental. It was not the passive noticing that anyone might do about anyone else. It was deliberate, sustained, and aimed at confirming something specific. Now place that behavior against the timeline. The investigation had already built around Nancy's disappearance, and the story shifts again. According to reports, Annie's attention to this person reportedly intensified in the weeks immediately preceding the event that changed everything. Before that period, the watching, if it happened at all, was reportedly occasional, something that might have gone unnoticed by anyone not specifically looking for it. But as the timeline moved closer to the date Nancy disappeared, the frequency reportedly increased. The windows got longer, the attention got sharper, and then, according to at least one account, something changed after Nancy's disappearance. The watching either intensified further, Annie reportedly becoming even more consumed with tracking this person's movements once Nancy was gone, or it stopped almost entirely, as though whatever she had been trying to confirm no longer needed confirming. Both possibilities are unsettling in their own way, and both are worth sitting with rather than rushing past. If the watching intensified after Nancy disappeared, it suggests Annie believed this person's movements were somehow connected to what had happened, that whatever she'd been tracking before had taken on new, urgent significance now that Nancy was missing. That would mean Annie's private suspicion, whatever it was, hadn't been resolved by the disappearance. It had been made more pressing by it. If the watching stopped, that's arguably more troubling. It could mean Annie got the confirmation she'd apparently been looking for, that whatever question she'd been trying to answer through all that quiet observation had finally been answered, one way or another, and there was nothing left to watch for. The investigation reportedly hasn't settled on which version is accurate, but the shift itself, a documented change in Annie's behavior around this person, occurring at almost exactly the moment Nancy disappeared, is precisely the kind of detail that turns a strange habit into a piece of evidence worth building a case around. It's not the only strange detail from this period either. According to multiple accounts, several other small anomalies reportedly clustered around the same time frame. Details that, on their own, might mean very little, but that start to form a pattern once placed alongside everything else. There was reportedly a visitor who arrived late at night on more than one occasion, someone whose presence at that hour was never fully explained to the people who noticed it. There was a vehicle, according to one account, that didn't match anything regularly associated with the property or the people who frequented it, parked in a spot that gave a clear view of the house, then gone before morning. There was a conversation, described by a witness as brief and tense, that ended abruptly when the people involved apparently realized they were being observed, and there was, by more than one account, a figure seen near the property boundary on separate occasions, never approaching the house directly, never explaining their presence to anyone who might have asked. None of these details, taken individually, proves anything. A late-night visitor could mean nothing. An unfamiliar car could belong to anyone. A tense conversation happens in every family, every situation, every ordinary life, under ordinary stress. But the accumulation of these small, unexplained details, clustered tightly around the same window of time that Annie was reportedly watching someone with unusual focus, is exactly the kind of pattern that investigators reportedly can't ignore, even when no single piece of it amounts to proof. It's the accumulation, not any individual thread, that reportedly caught Brian Entin's attention when he began digging into this part of the case. According to his reporting, Entin spoke with several people who described the watching behavior independently of one another. People who, as far as the reporting indicates, had no reason to coordinate their accounts and no apparent motive to exaggerate what they'd seen. What he reportedly found, piecing those accounts together, was that the person Annie had been watching wasn't a peripheral figure in the broader story. That person had already surfaced, in other contexts, in other threads of the investigation, appearing in places and moments that, until this detail came to light, hadn't seemed connected to anything Annie herself was doing. That's the piece that reportedly reframes everything. If the person Annie was watching had already appeared elsewhere in the investigation's timeline, in a context unrelated to Annie's own behavior, then Annie's watching wasn't just a private habit. It was, potentially, her own independent discovery of a connection that the broader investigation was only beginning to establish through separate means. In other words, Annie may have noticed something before investigators did, not because she had access to information they didn't have, but because she was paying attention to a person, in a specific place, at specific times, in a way that no formal investigation was structured to capture until much later. If that's accurate, it reframes the entire behavior. It's no longer just a strange habit worth noting. It's potentially one of the earliest points at which someone close to this case recognized that a specific person's presence mattered, long before the official investigation caught up to the same conclusion. That's the version of this story that makes Annie look less like someone hiding something and more like someone who saw something coming before anyone else did. But it's not the only version. And this is where the story takes its sharpest turn, because there's another way to read everything you've just heard, a way that flips the meaning of Annie's watching entirely, And it's the interpretation that several people close to the reporting apparently consider more consistent with everything else known about her. What if the person Annie was watching wasn't the actual focus of her attention at all? What if that person was simply a means to an end? Someone whose movements Annie was tracking not because she suspected them directly, but because their comings and goings led her towards someone else. Someone operating behind the scenes. Someone this person's visits, timing, and behavior were inadvertently revealing. Under this version, Annie wasn't watching a suspect. She was watching a witness, a person whose ordinary movements, if tracked carefully enough, would eventually expose a connection to someone else entirely. Someone Annie may have already suspected was involved, but couldn't confirm without first understanding who this person was meeting, when, and why much. If that's what was happening, then the watching wasn't reactive vigilance. It was investigative technique. Annie, building her own case, quietly, using the same methods any investigator would use: observation, pattern recognition, timing, but without any of the institutional backing or legal protection that would normally come with that kind of work. And if that's true, it means the real target of Annie's suspicion has never been named. The person she was watching may have been nothing more than a thread she was pulling on her way towards someone else. Someone who, to this day, according to the reporting, remains unidentified in any account that surfaced publicly. That twist is the kind of detail that should make you rethink everything you've heard up to this point. Every account of Annie standing at a window, every witness description of her asking pointed questions about someone's schedule, every strange late-night visitor, every unfamiliar car, every tense conversation cut short. What if none of it was ultimately about the person being watched, and all of it was about someone that person was unknowingly leading Annie toward? If you've made it this far into the story, it's because you understand how carefully these details need to be handled. And honestly, that's exactly the kind of attention this case deserves. If you want to be here when the next piece of this investigation comes out, subscribe now, because the reporting on this is still developing, and what comes next may change how this entire timeline reads. Because here's what the reporting still can't answer. If Annie really was watching this person as a way of tracking someone else, if her attention was never really about the individual she appeared to be focused on, then the identity of that other person, the one she may have actually been trying to expose, has never been established in anything that's reached the public record. Investigators reportedly know more than has been disclosed. The forensic and testimonial record apparently contains details that haven't surfaced in any account available right now. And the trial proceedings still ahead will presumably bring at least some of that picture into public view, including, potentially, exactly who Annie was really watching for, and whether she ever got close enough to the truth to understand what she was looking at. Until then, one question sits at the center of everything you've just heard, and it doesn't have a clean answer yet. What exactly did Annie see in that person's comings and goings that made her keep watching, night after night, for as long as she apparently did? Was it a pattern that confirmed a fear she'd been carrying quietly? Was it evidence of something she'd already suspected, finally coming into focus? Or was it something else entirely? A discovery that led her somewhere no one has fully accounted for yet. Whether she noticed a warning sign, a suspicious visitor, or something far bigger than either of those, remains unknown. And according to every account currently available, investigators are still following every lead that this detail opened up. There was reportedly a visitor who arrived late at night on more than one occasion. Someone whose presence at that hour was never fully explained to the people who noticed it. There was a vehicle, according to one account, that didn't match anything regularly associated with the property or the people who frequented it, parked in a spot that gave a clear view of the house, then gone before morning. There was a conversation, described by a witness as brief and tense, that ended abruptly when the people involved apparently realized they were being observed. And there was, by more than one account, a figure seen near the property boundary on separate occasions, never approaching the house directly, never explaining their presence to anyone who might have asked. None of these details, taken individually, proves anything. A late-night visitor could mean nothing. An unfamiliar car could belong to anyone. A tense conversation happens in every family, every situation, every ordinary life, under ordinary stress. But the accumulation of these small, unexplained details, clustered tightly around the same window of time that Annie was reportedly watching someone with unusual focus, is exactly the kind of pattern that investigators reportedly can't ignore, even when no single piece of it amounts to proof. It's the accumulation, not any individual thread, that reportedly caught Brian Entin's attention when he began digging into this part of the case. According to his reporting, Entin spoke with several people who described the watching behavior independently of one another. People who, as far as the reporting indicates, had no reason to coordinate their accounts and no apparent motive to exaggerate what they'd seen. What he reportedly found, piecing those accounts together, was that the person Annie had been watching wasn't a peripheral figure in the broader story. That person had already surfaced, in other contexts, in other threads of the investigation, appearing in places and moments that, until this detail came to light, hadn't seemed connected to anything Annie herself was doing. That's the piece that reportedly reframes everything. If the person Annie was watching had already appeared elsewhere in the investigation's timeline, in a context unrelated to Annie's own behavior, then Annie's watching wasn't just a private habit. It was, potentially, her own independent discovery of a connection that the broader investigation was only beginning to establish through separate means. In other words, Annie may have noticed something before investigators did. Not because she had access to information they didn't have, but because she was paying attention to a person, in a specific place, at specific times, in a way that no formal investigation was structured to capture until much later. If that's accurate, it reframes the entire behavior. It's no longer just a strange habit worth noting. It's potentially one of the earliest points at which someone close to this case recognized that a specific person's presence mattered, long before the official investigation caught up to the same conclusion. That's the version of this story that makes Annie look less like someone hiding something and more like someone who saw something coming before anyone else did.